Welcome to Selling Secrets, the show about action movies and spy films. Our mission is to look at the movies we love and go behind the scenes to find out what makes a successful Hollywood blockbuster. From interviews to movie reviews, marketing campaign analysis, and more, Selling Secrets is your home of spy films and action movies. Do you know what it takes to make a Hollywood blockbuster successful? Let's find out together on Selling Secrets. Hello and welcome to Season 2, Episode 2 of Selling Secrets. I'm your host, Josh Gay. Today, I've got a very special interview with best-selling romance and adventure author Roland Hulme. I'm very excited to release this interview as I've been wanting to get Roland on the podcast for quite some time now. Ever since I came across him on the Bond Experience's Bond Book Club, I've found his insights into being an author, as well as story structure, and being a Bond fan incredibly insightful, and I thought he could bring a really unique perspective into the discussions that we have on this podcast. So without further ado, here's my interview with Roland Hulme. Welcome to Selling Secrets. I'm your host, Josh Gay. Joining me today is a very special guest who I've been wanting to get on the show for a very long time now. He's an author, he's an advertising professional, and a good friend who I've been speaking with and haven't had a chance to speak with in person until now. So I'd like to welcome onto the show Roland Hulme. Roland, thank you very much for coming on.
Oh, it's my pleasure. When you say special person, what kind of special are we talking about there?
Well, I look up to you. I've been following your work for some time now. I came across you on David Zaritsky's podcast, obviously, the Bond Experience. I think the first time I found out who you were, and I did a big deep dive into your work and have followed you ever since. So it's a real honor to have you on. Thank you.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you very much. You make me feel quite special in a good way. No, I know I'm really loving your podcast. So hopefully I'm going to do your other guests justice. I know you've got Luke coming up soon as well.
Yes, absolutely. I've got Luke coming on. I've got James, who runs the James Bond Down Under fan page as well. And a couple of really exciting other guests. I guess I can say it now. I've also got Calvin Dyson coming on as well. So it's shaping up to be a bit of fun this season, I think.
That is awesome. And I love what you do because I'm super into like action movies and like 80s action movies have such a special place in my heart that it's almost like where my writing comes from, which I'm sure we'll get into talking about. So I dig what you do. It's really, really cool.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. That means a lot. Well, tell us, my audience may not know who you are. I know who you are, but tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are and what you do.
Okay, well, my name is Roland Hulme, and I might not look like it, but I write romance novels. I've been writing romance novels for the last 7 or 8 years now, and I've been pretty successful at it. Sold over 67,000 copies. I've reached 320,000 readers on Kindle Unlimited, and it's been something that has been really exciting for me because I've wanted to be a writer my entire life. And, you know, when I found my niche, which is this weird thing that I do where I take concepts and ideas that were inspired by 80s action movies and the structure and format of a romance novel, and I smush them together and I write books that appeal to a certain audience who keep buying them, thankfully. And I'm very, very grateful to them. And that's what I do. So, yeah, it's fun because it's something that coincides with so many different passions of mine because you get to tell stories and create characters and take inspirations. And it's like having a limitless play set of action figures, and you can just like smush them together and you can have, you know, your characters from the Avengers battling Batman or Lego or whatever.
That's amazing. Well, how did you get into writing? You said you started roughly 7 years ago. I'd really be keen to hear how you got into it and how you got your start.
Well, actually, I've wanted to be a writer since I was 9 years old. So my mother was actually a writer. She's written a bunch of exciting books like The Book of the Pig, published in, I think, 1977.
Wow.
But when I grew up, she was always clacking away at her electric typewriter, and it inspired me. And my parents loved books. They had like a library of 3,000 books, and we all read in the house all the time. And the interesting thing was we all shared books, even though there were boys' books and girls' books, so to speak. My mother used to read the women's literature. She had so many books she loved, like the Australian sagas. I can't remember the name of all the authors, but there were so many like women's sagas set in Australia, and when Australia was being colonized for the first time, and she'd read them and devour them, and then she'd pass them on, and I'd read them. So I kind of got half of the stuff that I read was women's literature and romance novels and things like that. And the other half was my father, which was adventure stories by like Clive Cussler and Wilbur Smith. And then the James Bond books. There was The Saint by Leslie Charteris. And he also loved sci-fi, huge sci-fi fan. And I loved this so much that it just gave me a passion for reading. And I always wanted to tell stories. And my mother, being a writer, kind of inspired me to try writing. So from 9 years old, I said, I'm going to be a writer. And it took me a long, long time to actually find a level of success at it. But my whole life I've been writing. And the nice thing is most of my life I've been writing just for the passion of it, not necessarily, ever thinking I'd get anywhere. I've got so many rejection slips from people. I've got, every check I ever earned from writing, I keep, even though it's like $25. It's kind of ridiculous to see the little wins and the little successes. But then finally, thanks to Amazon and the whole idea of self-publishing, I was able to achieve my dream. And it's just been a wild ride ever since. And I'm just so grateful that people actually read my books. And I try really, really hard to write books that appeal to people and are good and, worth whatever it is that they spend to read it.
Oh, that's absolutely amazing to hear. So 3,000 books, I can't even imagine.
Oh, hang on. When you said 3,000 books.
No, your family library.
Oh, 3,000. Yeah, it was
3,000 books. And I'm just trying to picture how much space that must take up.
It was weird. Our house, we lived in a bunch of old houses, and there were just corridors that were just lined with bookshelves. And you'd have, like, I remember in particular, my parents had this ridiculous old farmhouse that dated back to the Doomsday Book. And there was this one long, really weird curved corridor, and it's just book after book. And I used to lie on the floor there and read my father's science fiction books because they categorized them. So that was the science fiction section. And now I think about it, it was right next door to my mother's racier, like, stories. There was, I can't remember who wrote Lace, but there was also Harold Robbins and Jackie Collins and stuff like that. So, I pick up one book, pick up another book, pick up one book, and it was an interesting mishmash together.
Absolutely. It's a very diverse reading set. I mean, outside of your parents, obviously, they were a huge inspiration for you in terms of your writing and how you got the passion for it. Can you tell me who else you've looked up to in the literary world who you really pull from?
As I would say, my biggest passion, the thing that really made it for me, was The Saint. So I was in my teen years watching James. I love James Bond movies to a huge extent, and I'll get into James Bond obviously. But he said you ought to try reading The Saint, and I read it, and it was just I just fell in love with the idea of a larger-than-life, heroic, suave, cool character. And so, fortunately, Leslie Charteris wrote like 80 books, so I was always going around secondhand bookshops reading those. The next logical step is James Bond, and I read the Ian Fleming books. And then I read all of the all of the John Gardner books, and then all of the Raymond Benson books, and I just devoured all of them. And the wonderful thing is the mishmash of where you've got the James Bond films, which I really enjoyed, and the James Bond books, and your imagination. It's like when you read the books, you can pick who's going to be playing James Bond, and you can pick the scenery. And I loved the way you could follow the same stories in different formats, and that's what really got me into the James Bond movies. Actually, what really got me into the James Bond movies was the first James Bond movie I ever saw, which was The Man with the Golden Gun. And it was Britt Eklund in a bikini who got me into James Bond movies. I was like, oh, I can see the appeal of this.
Yeah, as a young kid, I definitely was drawn to her. I don't know why, though. I think it might have been the bikini, but there was just something about her, maybe her personality.
think so. Actually, do you know what? The blonde hair and the accent. I had a German au pair who was blonde, so maybe there was something there.
Right, we're getting into Freudian psychosexual analyzing now.
Well, that's what Ian Fleming is all about. That's the beauty of it. There's so much to pick apart and dissect from all of those.
Well, yeah, I mean, you look at the way Fleming wrote just from different perspectives. His writing style evolved so much, and you look at little experiments that he did, like The Spy Who Loved Me, for an instance, and that's you just think this guy has such a rich imagination, and just analyzing that is crazy. And that's why I love watching the Bond book clubs that you've been a part of, that David holds, because you hear these different opinions from professionals like yourself, and people who are fans of it, and you pick up on little things that you may never have thought of when you were reading the book yourself.
Yeah, you know, you've had a guest, David Trabogelis, you had on, didn't you?
Yeah, David Trabogelis. Yeah, correct.
Yes, sorry, I got this. He and I had a chat, and I find it so interesting. There are so many elements from James Bond as a franchise and the books and things that resonate with him as an openly gay man. There are so many elements that resonate with me as weirdo who like writer folks. There's so many elements that resonate with you. And when you get the chance to sit down and do a book club, you know, the things that stand out to other people might be things that never occurred to you. And then you start looking into it and seeing things in a whole new way. I mean, like Ian Fleming, there are certain passages that were so scandalous at the time. I remember in Dr. No, I think he described Honeychild's backside as like that of a boy. And like Noel Coward, who was his friend, was like, good Lord, Ian, how could you write that? But it's funny. And he did that like so shamelessly in the 60s. And there is definitely no question like, oh, was Ian Fleming a homosexual? It's like, no, he was always known as like the ladies' man, but then he put stuff in there that there are different elements that are really quite subversive for the time period he's in. And people don't necessarily think of James Bond as subversive in a bad way. They're always like, oh, you know, ladies in bikinis and all sorts of sexist tropes. But actually, it was quite progressive at its time, and it sneaked them in through the formula of a thriller, which is kind of interesting because I love writing romance novels, and people are just like, oh, it's only romance novels. But you can sneak some really interesting personal beliefs into what you write that resonate with people.
I think romance as a genre in general commentates on society at its time so much, because you're pulling from what your beliefs are at the time, or potentially what you see the beliefs of, if you're writing a period piece, how you as a modern person writing that see those past times as well.
Yeah, it is amazing how much the world has changed as well. I mean, I was on the Bond book club for Goldfinger, and the amazing thing to me is reading that book. They were staying at the Fontainebleau? I can't remember the name of the resort that James Bond ended up staying with Mr. Dupont, but Jews weren't allowed there, and it's mentioned in the book. You know, the Jews weren't allowed in. And I was just thinking, like, here we are in a Bond book club hosted by David Zaritsky, who's Jewish. And it's one of the things to like look back at that thing. And it's interesting that a period in time existed within the lifetime of people who are Bond fans, in which you could exclude people from society. And it paints everything in such a weird way.
And that book was written post World War II. And those viewpoints were still held, which is just baffling to me. Yeah,
62, I think it was when it was written. I can't remember, but that's not that long ago. And no, exactly. I like to think Ian Fleming wrote about them, but I don't think he necessarily represented anything. People always give Ian Fleming a bad rap as like sexist or racist, but actually he just wrote the society as it was. Like a journalist, because his background was in journalism. And it's nice because we get kind of an authentic take on like what the South of America was like in the 60s and how different it is to how we exist now and the values that we have now.
Well, there's a certain chapter in Live and Let Die, which I won't name now, but you could never write that as a chapter header in the 21st century, let alone the late 20th century. So, it's a phenomenal time capsule to look back on. That's for sure. And going back to yourself, we've gone off on a bit of a tangent.
Sorry, yeah.
On Fleming, we touched on the fact that you're a romance writer. One thing that I found really interesting when doing my research on you, when I first started, diving deeply into you, was that you actually started writing under a female pseudonym. Why did you originally choose to write under that pseudonym? And then, likewise, what made you, make the decision to release books under your actual name as a male author?
Oh, that's such an interesting one. So, back in the days of traditional publishing, the publishers did used to say, like, women won't buy books written by men, men won't buy books written by women. And I had a friend, she's called Robin Young, and she just released a book actually, which I definitely recommend, and I'll tell you to drop a link in your description or something. But when she was writing historical fiction, she wrote this incredible historical fiction series set during the Crusades. Her publisher said, listen, you can't use your actual name because men aren't going to buy historical fiction written by women. You have to change your name to something androgynous. And so she did. And when I started off self-publishing, I started off with the name Simon Scarlett because I thought it sounded a bit like the saint. And then somebody who I was talking to on a Reddit post was like, what are you doing? Nobody's going to buy romance novels written by a man. So I changed it to Simone Scarlett, which I actually thought was more elegant. But there was definitely this feeling that if you wanted to be a romance writer, you had to be a woman. So, it made me kind of uncomfortable. And I never, ever tried to deceive anyone. I never tried to create a persona of myself as a woman. I just wrote under that name. But as I wrote and as I became more successful, it's something that started gnawing at me because it's like it. And eventually I got to the stage where I wrote High Point, which is actually released also as a Simone Scarlett novel. It's got a different cover with a big butch guy in a sailor's cap and tattoos and things. But I wrote that book. And it was the one. It changed my life and it changed my perspective on writing because it was a book that I woke up every day excited to write, and it's an action story, and it's got this boat in it, and the characters in it. I mean, that particular book, I remember I woke up at 3 a.m. in December and stopped writing the book I was writing, and I said I have to tell this story. And I think I literally grabbed the personalities of people from my real life and mushed them together into an adventure story setup that I'd already built to from other books. And I just threw these characters into a situation, and just my knowledge of their personalities helped it unfold. And because I based it on people around me, it was really real and personal to me. And I was like, I want to publish. I want people to know that I wrote this book because I'm proud of all the books I wrote, but this one I really, really want to do. So, interestingly enough, it was I gave a copy to David and Danielle Zaritsky, and it was Danielle Zaritsky who actually read it and was like, "This is really good. This should be a screenplay." And that was where I thought, you know what, I'm going to do it. So I designed the male version, which is this one, with a cover that it was actually a cover inspired by the Clive Cussler books because I thought
I was going to say it's very, very Clive Cussler-esque.
And I published it, and I published it under my own name, and I started to think of it as like a social experiment. It's like, hey, is the style of a romance novel actually something that might appeal to men? And I believe it is. I believe, I've got boats and guns and explosions and interesting things, and my writing style is so heavily influenced by Ian Fleming. So I think there are elements to it that will appeal to men, but I write it in the format and the structure and the first-person perspective of a romance novel. So it's something that will be familiar to people who appreciate romance novels, and it's like smushing them together. And the interesting thing is, we're talking about Ian Fleming. He always wrote James Bond, third-person perspective, like Bond did this, Bond did that. Then he wrote The Spy Who Loved Me, first-person perspective from a woman's perspective, which is the traditional style of a contemporary romance novel. So it's interesting no one ever talks about the fact that in some ways The Spy Who Loved Me was clearly influenced heavily by romance.
Absolutely. Anyway, and
that's an aside.
Sorry, go on.
Oh, and since then, this book, I mean, it was only in the free rankings, but it actually shot up to #1 in the charts for men's adventure and action adventure and something else. And so I was like, I'm going to start releasing my other books with newly designed covers under my own name, just because I want it to be out there. And it also kind of gave me permission to start thinking about writing new stuff under my own name, because maybe I can approach it from the other angle. And Simone Scarlett lives on, and I still am always going to publish my romance novels under her first, to like give loyalty to the readers who helped me achieve this. But by coming out and being like, yes, this is me, I write under this name, but this is actually me, it has just changed my life, because I feel so much more authentic. And I've a lot of fans, when I actually wrote out, I've got a subscriber list of like 3,000 people. And so I sent out an email and was like, listen, okay, I'm Simone Scarlett. You've been following me for years. I'm actually who I am. And I got like 100 emails back from people being like, we don't care. We love you. We love your books. It's awesome. We support you in everything you do. And I was like, I literally had tears in my eyes. I was like so touched. And I hadn't expected that, because I'm not a very emotional person. But it was great. It was like being given permission to be yourself, and being given permission to own the success that I'd managed to achieve thanks to these incredible readers of mine.
It's very authentic. Well, let's talk about High Point for a little bit, because that was, the first book of yours that I read. I love the two perspectives that you write that book from, and it's clearly pulling from, as you said, Clive Cussler, and I was a big fan, obviously. I think Sahara was the first of his that I read, and went down the Dirk Pitt rabbit hole there. My dad introduced me to him, so that it really hit a key with me. Can you tell us a little bit about the story, a little bit more?
So it's interesting. One of the things that when you start with the romance novels, you've got to come up with like the concept for it, and the concept always has to be the romance. It's like, which two characters are we going to get to plug together? And in my other books, it's all based around this motorcycle club called the Knuckleheads, and each book is about a separate couple, but they all exist in the same universe. And so you sometimes have threads. And there was this one character who had got lost from the others. His name was Max. And I knew that he was out there in this universe. And I knew that because of things I'd set up in the other books, these guys in black were going to come and try and kill him with machine guns. And one night I woke up at 3 a.m. and I was like, okay, wait a second. This is a story here. We got Max, this guy, and people are going to come and kill him. But what's he doing with his life? And how am I going to build that into a romance? And I have to admit, my wife and I were arguing a lot at that particular point in time. And I thought, wouldn't it be an interesting idea if there were two people who were arguing a lot and they had a romance story about falling back in love? And so immediately I had like my feisty heroine there. And then I grabbed some other characters to like populate this thing. And I knew as well, I'd written one other book that was like a sea adventure. And I was like, I want this to be a sea adventure. So I said in Florida, and I started Googling boats, military surplus boats. And I found like one cruiser type boat that was relatively cheap to buy. So I was like, use that as inspiration. But I actually found a unique boat that was actually literally for sale. It was called the PCH-1 High Point. And it was an experimental hydrofoil boat that Boeing built with the US Navy in the 1960s. And it had been left abandoned in Seattle, and it was on sale for $45,000. And I thought, you could literally just take that boat and maybe he bought it if he's got $45,000 because he's some crazy dude living in the Everglades. And so that was the boat that was there. And then I started doing research into the boat, and that was a rabbit hole, because it was like, this is an incredible craft and it's really there. And then I thought, how can I build this story? And it was very easy there. As I said, all these things pieced together. So we had Max, and he was having an argument with his wife. In fact, I was going to get them. They were divorcing. It was the day of their divorce. And then those guys in black who were going to shoot him turned up and tried to shoot him. But of course, Max is a bit of a badass, and his friend is a bit of a badass. So they managed to scatter them off. But of course, these guys in black, I thought, what can trigger some kind of incredible story that brings our hero and heroine together? So her 6-year-old daughter, his stepdaughter, gets kidnapped, and they have to jump in this decrepit old boat and go off on an adventure to find them. And it's like the story just fell together so perfectly. I was almost like compelled to write it. I had to get up at that point and start hammering away. And it was exhilarating for me because I got to go on this journey with them. And I kind of screwed myself in a certain way because I based so many of the characters on people I knew that it felt so deeply personal to me that you got very invested in it. And that's why I think it was the book that like changed everything for me, because it was the first book that I was like, this really is something special.
Absolutely. I think what makes it so special is those relatable characters, as you've drawn them from people that you know, but I mean, everyone's had, arguments with their partners, and obviously, divorce rates around the world are so high. So it's such a relatable story. It's not like James Bond where it's this otherworldly character, where it's, you can't really be on the same level as him ever. Whereas, Max, he's ex-military, but he's fallible. He's sort of failed at being a husband, and I think that's something that I latched onto, was how human your characters are. Speaking of High Point in general, so all of your books you've self-published, correct? What made
Yes.
you choose to self-publish, and did you ever consider going down that more traditional route?
Well, I got a lot of rejection slips over the course of the years, and I probably deserved all of them, but I never had any success with traditional publishing. And I never really knew what to do until one day Amazon released the Kindle, and they released the ability to publish your own books on the Kindle. And people started saying, like, oh, you can make a bit of money doing that, especially if you write like saucy stories. And I used to write saucy stories in my spare time. The first paycheck I ever got for writing was actually from Hustler magazine for a short story I wrote.
Get out.
So yeah, I have $25, and I still have that check that
That's
I got.
so cool.
So I used to write these smutty stories. So I started uploading them to Amazon and published them. And they would, I just like threw up a Word document, and I made the cover with stock art using PowerPoint. I mean, they looked terrible, but the weird thing was they sold. Like in my first month of uploading, like the 15 stories I'd written, I made $300. And suddenly I was like, wait a second, I can actually do this. And so I kept publishing, and I kept writing the smarty stories and things like that. And I built up to a certain level of success. And then somebody said, oh, the real money's in writing novels. And I thought, okay, I better start writing novels. What can I do? And I decided just to tell the stories that I'd always wanted to tell, the ones that I got all the rejection slips for, the adventure stories, and the with the guns and the explosions and all of the inspiration from like 80s movies. I thought I'd tell those stories, but I just write them in the style of romance novels. So first person perspective from a hero's perspective, first person from a woman's perspective, back and forth. And then you've got the structure, they have a mild separation at the end of Act 1. And then Act 2 is them really breaking up, and then they have to come back. There's a really rigid structure to romance novels, but it makes the kind of traditional structure of action stories and adventure stories have this really zesty new twist when you tell it in that way. It's like, imagine Raiders of the Lost Ark, except you didn't concentrate on them trying to find the Ark of the Covenant. You concentrated purely on Marion and Indy falling in love. But it's the same story, and the same things could be going on in the background. It's just what you choose to focus on. And I think that's one of the things for men's adventure stories and spy novels and stuff like that. I will admit, I don't think I was ever successful writing in third-person perspective in the traditional style of a guy, because that's been done to death. I mean, who am I? There's nothing really interesting about me. But then when you tell those stories in the style of a romance novel, suddenly it's fresh and interesting. It's like, even just writing first-person perspective, it suddenly makes things easy. It's like a cheat code to try and build a connection with the reader, because when you're telling things from first-person perspective, if you write "I am cold," then the reader will shiver, and it makes it an interesting and zesty way to tell the stories that I want to tell. And then it just became like an addiction.
Well, you get inside the head of the characters more, rather than it being just actions. And what I love so much about your books is you don't rely on, let's talk Indy, for example. You're not relying on a MacGuffin. You're not relying on, we're trying to find the Ark of the Covenant. It's all about the relationships. And I think that's why I love the new Bond film, No Time to Die, so much, is because towards the end, it goes down the MacGuffin route, but predominantly it's about a relationship between two people. And the struggles that they go through, and falling out of love and coming back together. And those, for me personally, are the stories that I really gravitate towards. So that's why I love your writing so much.
Oh, but wow, I totally agree with that. I mean, I know there are a lot of people who don't like No Time to Die, but for me, it was a trip, and it hit really hard right here for precisely that reason you're talking about. It's like Bond is suddenly a dad, and he's suddenly got so much more in it. And also the anger. The thing that got me is the anguish at knowing that Blofeld portrayed him stole 5 years that he could have had with Madeline. He could have like seen his daughter born, seen her take her first steps, say her first words. That was all stolen from him. And then like having this little girl there and like everything, I could feel what he must have been going through. And I think that's why it resonated so deeply with me. And also on my favorite Bond movies, on Majesty's Secret Service. So I've totally romanticized like the Tracy Bond thing. And when I was watching it with my kids and they had that first scene in Matera, they're zooming down the highway in the DB5 and they play that sting from On Her Majesty's Secret Service. I clung to the side. I was like, oh my God. And for me, it was like the film was written specifically for me. And I mean, I think a lot of people say that and feel that way. It's like, everyone's like, oh my goodness, they overplayed it with the sting from On Her Majesty's Secret Service. They did this wrong. They leaned too heavily into this. I was like, you know what? They leaned too heavily just right. It's like, I don't care. Yeah, overkill is underrated.
Absolutely. Well, and that's again why I love Casino so much. You know, the villain's plot of Casino it's non-existent, really. What he wants to win some money back that he lost. What you're focusing on primarily is the relationship between Bond and Vesper. So the two of them, three on Her Majesty's Secret Service, 3 of my favorite Bond films are ones that are they're about people and how people interact with each other.
Yeah. And you know what? Everyone gives James Bond a bad rap, but at the end of the day, Bond fans really gravitate towards the stories in which there is like a really strong romantic thing. It's like, you know, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, everyone's favorite is like Casino Royale. And even if your favorite Craig movie isn't Casino Royale, your favorite relationship is probably Vesper. And and then of course No Time to Die. And the thing with that, it's like men, I think, fall in love and treat romance just as seriously as women do. It's just we've never really kind of been given permission to.
Big time. And you look at all the fan pages and the people who do fall in love with not necessarily the actress, but they fall in love with the character that the actress is playing. I think men like to put on this big macho persona and, I'm James Bond, I'll womanize, you know, but realistically, we all want to be loved and we all want that human connection. And as much as, you know, having the life where you're saving the world all the time is, you know, it sounds exciting. I think what we all crave is that human connection on a one-on-one level.
Yeah, I think so. And I think also movies and fiction can give you really positive archetypes to have. I mean, for me, the other thing I used to love was that TV show, The Avengers, with John Steed and Emma Peel. And like, for me, their relationship, their back and forth, their banter as a man and a woman, even in the 60s, it was just so sexy and respectful and sharp. And like, men are really into that, and men want that kind of thing. They want strong female characters, but they want strong female characters who are real and authentic. They want like Ripley from Aliens or Sarah Connor from Terminator. They want characters who are women who are strong and just happen to be women, rather than today in this day and age we're always having like characters inserted in there and it's like hashtag strong woman. They don't actually bother putting the characterization in to make them strong. But
I think the term is a Mary Sue. Which I completely agree. I mean, some of my favorite films and TV series are all female led. I mean, La Femme Nikita, the Luc Besson film, Alias. What was the
Buffy the Vampire Slayer?
Buffy the Vampire Slayer, as much as old mate Joss Whedon is very problematic now.
Yes.
Buffy, Dark Angel as well with Jessica Alba. You know, these are all shows that I grew up watching and going, these are kick-ass women, and it's not bashed over your head that she's a woman, so she's strong. Like, it's a layered character, and you get to empathize with them. And I think that's where Hollywood's lost its way in a way. We want to, and we really want to write films that include everyone, but we're not doing it in an authentic way. And I think that's why I gravitate to your characters so much, because they feel authentic. They feel like they've had, you know, lives that they've lived, and they're not just there and magically now they've got the power of the Force to take on a Dark Lord who's been training for 50 years. They're a real person. I find that phenomenal. Now, going back to self-publishing, obviously that would be quite a challenging thing to do. I mean, one of my favorite authors is, I'm not sure if you've heard of him, Matthew Riley. He's a thriller author from Australia. He writes a number of different books, some from a military perspective, which is the Scarecrow novels, or the Jack West Jr. ones, which are almost like a modern Indiana Jones. He's done sci-fi, quite a number of things. And I've followed him since one of his first books that my dad introduced me, which was Contest. Actually, it was his first book. And he talks about the issues that he had in terms of in trying to get that book published. And he eventually went, fuck it, I'm going to self-publish this thing. And he published the book and it exploded. And now he's making a film on Netflix with Chris Hemsworth's wife. A phenomenal author if you haven't heard of him. And if you love 80s action films, his books are just 80s action films in a bloody novel. They're just page turner after page turner.
I'm actually, it's Matthew Riley with I'm actually going to put him on my list because I'm always interested to read those ones.
Mate, he's got like 20 books. You'll have a couple of months worth of reading. They're just awesome. The
Jack West series.
Yes, yeah, I love the Jack West series and the Scarecrow series. Two of my favorites, but even his standalone books are phenomenal. Anyway, I'm getting off topic.
But no, I mean you're talking about self-publishing.
Self-publishing, correct? Yeah, it must be a challenge. I mean, obviously you had the Amazon backing, which is super helpful, and at the time you were releasing the books, I'm guessing that was in its infancy as such. But how did you go about marketing your books? I mean, we talk about marketing on this podcast. That's my background. I'd be really interesting to hear, how did you approach marketing your self-published novels?
Very haphazardly, I would say, but it's when I started off in 2013, and then back then it was the Wild West, and so people weren't jumping in there to self-publish, and I was writing at the time like short, smutty stories, but about a very particular smutty niche, and there were lots of hungry readers who were like, "Oh my god, someone's writing this!" So all I had to do at that point was just publish them.
Yeah.
And for the buildup of my career in writing, what I learned was the secret to success is to write books that are better than the ones the traditional publishers put out, which just between you and me isn't that difficult these days. So I made sure that I wrote them professionally. I had a really, really good cover. I'm now a really good cover designer, actually, that's on brand. I made sure that my editing was really tight. I made sure my back matter all was put up together. So, at the end of book one in the series, you'd have the first chapter of book two and then a link to buy book two, because I knew if I could get them hooked, that's a reader for life. So I put a lot of thought and practice into what I was doing beyond what most traditional publishers do these days. And that's when organically I started to find some success. But those days are done now, because in around 2019, Amazon started to invest quite heavily in advertising on Amazon, which is where you can pay to have your books and your products appear alongside the ones that just appear in the search results organically. And that meant organic visibility just disappeared. So, I was very lucky. I started off in the wild days. In 2018, I was lucky enough to, if I wrote great books and had the right keywords and the right marketing and the right momentum, I could be prodigiously successful just through doing that. But these days, if you enter into it, you have to know about advertising and how to promote your books. And fortunately, I happen to come from an advertising background. So, and the other thing that was fortunate was I spent such a lot of time trying to make my books better than what the traditional publishers were putting out that I had a product people wanted to buy. And when you combine advertising with books that people want to buy, it becomes much easier to start doing it successfully. But nice. It's really tricky. If you want to be successful as a self-published author, you absolutely can. I believe anybody has the potential to be a successful self-published author. You just have to learn the craft of writing and then follow the process of successful self-publishing, but advertising is a part of that. So you will have to now invest time and effort and money into learning about advertising. But if you have a strong enough book and you have the time and the patience and the guts to get out of your comfort zone and figure out advertising that works, there is nothing stopping you being a successful self-published author. And compared to being traditionally published, there's no comparison. Traditional publishers are kaput. If you get even if you are lucky enough to have some random guy in an office deign that your manuscript is worthy of publication by a traditional publishing house, you will then get 10% an advance. That might be nice, and 10% of the royalties of that. Whereas if you're self-published, you don't get that some random person telling you, patting you on the head and telling you good job. So you have to actually put your own book out there under your own steam. But you get with Amazon 70% of the royalties. So that means you need to sell one book compared to 7 books to get the same income as a traditionally published author. And you also have complete control over everything. When you hand your book over to a traditional publisher, you lose all control of how they publish it and how they market it. And if you look at some of the books that are being put out these days, it's like the self-published authors have better covers, have more professional covers, have a stronger brand. And
I agree with that.
Yeah, you get to control everything. So if you learn about advertising and you have every single aspect of like the description and the cover and the metadata and stuff like this at your fingertips, you can be so much more successful than a traditionally published author, and you get so much more money for doing so.
Well, what are some of the tools that you use for your success as a self-published author on Amazon?
Well, it's not so much about tools. It's really about learning to produce a really, really strong book, and then learning how to use all of these amazing tools that you have at your disposal. So I remember back in 2015, I invested in Mark Dawson's Ads for Authors course, and I learned a lot doing that. It didn't actually pay off until 2018 because I've written 11 full-length books before I published my first bestseller. But that's where the real power lies, because if I wrote my first bestseller that exploded organically, but if you have a book that is, really successful and people want it, and then you combine that with a practical knowledge of advertising, the sky's the limit. But advertising it's not for the faint of heart, is it?
Definitely.
That
definitely. Working in the industry, you talking about Mark Dawson's course that you took and how it didn't pay off. That resonates with me. As went back to uni after doing my back, and the course, or even when I did my bachelor's degree, both of those courses didn't really pay off until years after I had actually done them. I was studying. When I went back to uni to study marketing, I was working as a car salesman because my bachelor's degree in film production can't get me anywhere. So it's a lot of hard work and a lot of just self-teaching and figuring out what you're good at and working from there. And I only started working at the ad agency I'm with in December of 2020, so November of 2020, sorry. But prior to that, I was working in marketing and car dealerships, and then prior to that, car sales, because of my injury. So but I learned so much doing those things, and you apply that knowledge that you learned. It may not have been something that pays off straight away, but if you keep plugging at it, it's going to pay off eventually.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was the stage there where I was just like, oh, yeah, Mark Dawson, I get it. And fortunately, I had that information in my back burner, and then I could put it into place.
So we're talking about Mark Dawson. I watched your video on your YouTube channel, and I highly recommend anyone listening this to go and check out your YouTube channel, because you talk about some incredible topics from films like the new Kingsman film all the way through to marketing for authors and how to be a successful author. Can you talk a little bit about more to the Mark Dawson course and how that helped you as a self-published author?
Yeah, because I think that one of the biggest things that you have as a problem as a self-published author is like, okay, you have to advertise your book, but it's difficult to know where to get started. And so the great thing about that course was you did the course and you took it, and he taught you step by step, stepping up ads and how to make things like a lookalike audience if you build a subscriber list. And he gives you kind of like a journey to go on. The problem is every single individual author's journey is going to be different. And I remember when I'm a big advocate of Mark Dawson's course, don't get me wrong, but when I first took that course, I had in my head this idea like, oh, this course is going to fix everything. I'm going to do ads for authors, and then immediately I'm going to be able to advertise my books, make a huge profit, and that's going to be as easy as that. And it wasn't. As I said, it took me 4 years before I published a book that was really, really successful and learned the formula of what you can write to be repetitively successful. And once you have a successful book, then all of the stuff he teaches you comes into play. So you've got to temper your expectations and understand that having all of the knowledge that a course like Mark Dawson's Ads for Authors will teach you won't actually necessarily make your book successful. You actually have to have a book people want to buy. And I made my own course. I don't quite know why, but it wasn't really about advertising, because I didn't want to take anything from Mark Dawson's course and fob it off as my own. And so I pretty much put together a course about like, these are the elements that you will need to have a successful book, like your cover and like your blurb and your keywords and things like that. So those two in combination are what you need to be successful. But I can't recommend Mark Dawson's course enough. And I think it still is absolutely the go-to on the market, even though it is extremely expensive. But if you can get it to work from you, then it's not extremely expensive. It's a bargain. If you can't,
Correct.
Then yeah.
And that's the thing. I mean, it's the same as university. University costs a packer. I'm lucky that I live in a country that, it's subsided, but you can't expect to go and get a degree and then you're going to be a successful lawyer. Like that's just not going to happen. You have to work at it. You have to, for me as a filmmaker, you have to network. You have to, do JVs or whatever it is and find people who you can work with or people who you can learn from and, pull inspiration from before you actually really are going to get any, knowledge out of it. And I think for me, university wasn't about learning the content. I had learned the basics and the fundamentals of camera already. So it was more about finding people who I could network with and, learn different points of view from. I think if you're going into any course and thinking that it's a silver bullet, then you're in it for the wrong reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things. It's not a ticket to do anything. The other problem with university education these days is there are so many different things you can study that aren't necessarily directly translatable. I have a joint honours in history and Victorian studies, which is Victorian English literature. So only books written in that period. And you know what?
Not Victoria or Australia.
But it's funny. It's like that's not necessarily a directly applicable skill. But the skills I learned studying that were really useful in my career and in becoming a writer. But yeah, it's not a dotted line.
Absolutely. And that's why when I was at university, I took as many electives as I could. Being a creative arts degree, we had access to the whole faculty of art. So I did, the core filmmaking courses, the film history courses, but then I went off and did a minor in journalism and creative writing, so I could better understand how those side of things work. Because in Australia, our industry is so small. You have to, in the film industry, if you want to be successful, you have to go and work in the States. I was lucky to be able to work on some pretty cool projects here, but realistically, you're going to be working as a freelancer. So learning the skills of creative writing or journalism, where you might be a camera operator for the journalist, but you're learning how to frame for a story or something like that. It's pulling those different aspects from university. But getting back onto books, you were saying Amazon has started to become a bit of a pay to play ecosystem. Is it something that you'd still recommend up and coming authors who are aspiring to break into the market? Would you recommend people still jump on Amazon as the first port of call?
I honestly don't think there is another port of call if you want to be a writer or an author of books, because it's the only place in town. But what you have to think is, if you're a creative person, it doesn't necessarily need to be the only way in which you can tell your stories. So I enjoy making YouTube videos because I enjoy rambling and stuff like that. But you start to realize that your creativity does have other opportunities. And, if I went back in time to me publishing my smutty stories on Amazon, I could probably have done much better with Patreon that didn't exist then, or in OnlyFans. I could write those smarty stories and publish them as you have access to them if you have a subscription to OnlyFans. So there are so many more opportunities for creative people to make money these days. But if you want to be a writer, I mean, my ambition is I want to be a New York Times bestselling author, Roland Hulme. That's what I'm going to do. And if you want to do that, then Amazon is the only game in town. And I think people have to accept that. There are other places you can buy books. There are other places you can sell books. But Amazon is the only place if you really, really want to be successful. But you can be. The opportunity exists, and they have given you the framework to do it. And it's not easy, but being a writer isn't easy. If you're crazy enough to spend 3 months writing a novel without even any guarantee that it's going to be published, then you're already crazy enough to throw your hat in with Amazon. I mean, you're clearly bonkers. Who would do that? What sort of crazy person would do that? And I wrote 11 books before my first really successful book. And I mean, I look back now and I'm like, what the hell was I doing? I could have been out playing golf or something, but no, I was sitting away hammering at my stupid stories. But then eventually it paid off. And that's the only thing that separates successful writers from unsuccessful writers, is doing it in the first place, and then doing it again, and then doing it again, and then looking in a mirror and be like, what's the point of this? But doing it again regardless. And then at some point, as long as you read the reviews that you get, and you look at other books in your marketplace, and you read for as many hours as you write, eventually you will start to get better and better and better, and you will find your audience out there. And then because you're self-published, it takes such a smaller audience to be successful at what you do. If you're a traditionally published author, you need to sell 100,000 books. Whereas if you're a self-published author, you need to sell 10,000 books. You sell 10,000 books and you can write a book every 3 months, then you have a very happy 6-figure career.
Absolutely. I think the 10,000 hours rule is such an applicable one there. Just keep plugging away, and overnight success is not a thing. It's long, hard hours, and that's something I really respect about anyone like yourself who are successful at, especially creative industries, because they're not silly stories. I know you say they're silly stories, but they're not. It's your passion. It's something that you want to be putting out into the world, and I have immense respect for people like you who have that conviction to keep going despite the rejection letters, and despite, that last one might not have been successful as the one before it, but you keep going and keep going. I think that's phenomenal.
The one thing is, I had a lot of imposter syndrome, and a lot of the time I was like, why the hell am I doing this thing? And I do get emails from my subscribers sometimes who, when I give out free books, they're like, oh, thank you. I'm suffering from cancer. Your books like yours, the only thing that keep me sane, and thank you for writing them. And I'm like, oh, my stories that I have to tell, because otherwise I would go crazy, are giving somebody pleasure and significance, and it's very humbling when you realize that people do actually read the stuff you're writing and these stories you tell, and they mean something to them. And the other thing that got me, somebody told me recently that when this pandemic hit and we were all stuck inside, where did we turn to? We turned to our TV shows and our films and our books and our video games. When things got really shitty, you turned to art. And I was like, you know what? Maybe that means that my art is worth something. And maybe that means art as a whole is worth something, because, okay, it might not, be like digging coal out of the ground or something like that. But at the end of the day, it does give people something. It gives them a sense of solace, a sense of resonance. It takes them on a journey. It makes them feel emotions. It lifts them out of the drudgery or the misery of their actual lives. It gives them hope. It gives them a belief. And I'm like, that's actually quite an incredible privilege to be able to do that. And all you have to do is just do it.
And throughout all of human history, storytelling is part of who we are. The things that stand the test of time are the drawings on the cave walls, the stories from 100 years ago, thousands of years ago. I mean, religion itself is a story, and that stuff has stood the test of time, and is things that, for better or worse, people are just so connected to. Coal powers, digging coal or digging gold or whatever it is that powers an economy or powers a house. But the things that make us who we are our art and our culture and our history. And I think I have nothing but respect for people who, contribute to that in some way, because it's just phenomenal. Back onto you, though, back onto your books. I mean, your books read like a movie. And that's something that I always, whilst they're in that sort of romance style, they feel very muchly like I'm reading a movie. I can see the action that's going on in my head. I can see the sex scenes, all that stuff that's going on. Have you ever considered writing a screenplay or writing a film?
It depends on the book, but High Point, especially, to me, when I wrote it, it was like writing a film. And I had this habit. When I'm in the great place, you write 2,000 words, 2,500 words a day, and you should call it quits about that. That's enough download from wherever it comes from. And then for the rest of the day, you think about what you're going to write tomorrow. And I would listen to movie soundtracks. It was the Iron Man 3 soundtrack that I was listening to with the action scenes there. And then as I was doing the washing up, I had this vision of like the High Point weaving through explosions in the waters and people shooting at them while I was listening to this music. And yeah, that book in particular came to me like a screenplay. And I kind of based it off Star Wars in a certain way, because the oil rig in it is the Death Star and the High Point is a Millennium Falcon.
Holy
and
shit,
they have
I never
to go
saw it like that. Oh my God.
And Paulie, of course, is Obi-Wan, and he sacrifices himself before they blow up the Death Star. And it's funny, I had very specifically thought that, but that's why I worked that book to me was like a screenplay.
Holy crap, that never crossed my mind. I'm just sitting here like shook. I'm gonna have to go back and read it now.
It was weird because I was doing it and then I just like leaned into it and I was like, yeah, Max is Han Solo and Marty is Luke and Paulie is Obi-Wan and
the daughter's Princess. You're rescuing Princess Leia.
Well, kind of, and her mum is like Princess Leia.
Yeah.
Carrie Fisher and Princess Leia was so badass because she was like,
oh my God, I love Carrie.
You would have her on your side with a blaster. She could do as well as any of the boys, and that's what I wanted my character Tina to be like in this book, because that's, I mean, that, and I said I was inspired by my wife, and my wife is exactly like that. Like I say, if there is a cinematic rendition of our relationship, it probably is Han and Marion Luke and Leia, just because it's like they're always arguing and bantering, but secretly they love each other.
Oh, that's incredible. You talk in your YouTube videos quite a bit about films, and obviously you speak very passionately about James Bond. In terms of story structure, when setting out to write, whether it's a short form story or a full length novel, how do you approach setting it out? Do you have in terms of film speak, for instance, do you have a beginning, middle, and end 3-act structure, or does that come organically to you?
I think it comes organically to all of us. I think all of us deep down kind of know what a story is like because we absorb a lot of stories. But for me, something that really changed my style of writing, it was a friend of mine called Christine Angeles, who did a class in a writing group I'm part of about story structure. And he used this thing called the story circle, which was created by Dan Harmon, who wrote that show Community, and he invented Rick and Morty. And it is a sort of it's an 8-point structure about how a story should be told. And you can look at any movie. Star Wars is the perfect example of like how that structure works. And it starts off with you, which is the main character. And who is the main character? Then it has need. And your main character in a story has to need something. He can't want something. He has to need something. Like they need to save Bella, or they need to save the princess. Want doesn't cut it. And then go is the next step, which is the hero takes action. And the hero takes action because he knows what to do. He knows what he needs, and he thinks he knows what it is. And every single good story, and it's kind of crazy when you look at it this way, because it dissects every story you ever experience. When the hero takes action, it always fails and blows up in his face, and he gets cast off into a part of the story circle they call search, which is when he's in the wilderness trying to figure himself out all anew. And he goes on a different part of the journey. And this is where 90% of the movie is, with the explosions and the action scenes and the escape sequences. And eventually he gets what he wants, but he got to it in a way that I call it he, it could be a she, it could be anyone. They get to it in a way that's completely unexpected. He thought he had it figured out. It blew up in his face, but a different route took him to the same place. But he has to make a sacrifice before he can have his prize. And then he returns. They call it a circle because the hero or heroine always return to the same point at the beginning, just fundamentally changed. And once I saw how you could put stories into that particular structure, it makes them so much more satisfying. But that's great for long form fiction. But when it's short form fiction, what is the essence of a story? And to me, a story, and this is why you can tell stories in tweets or in adverts or anything like that, is you make your audience feel an emotion. Like, let's say you see a picture of a poor, skinny, sad dog with his ribs and showing, and you're like, oh, that poor animal. And then you show them another picture, which is that same dog, all butch and healthy, with a K9 police uniform on because he got adopted by a cop and now he works for the police force. You start off seeing that picture and you feel sad. And then you see the next picture and you feel happy and uplifted. You went on an emotional journey, and stories should be about emotional journeys. So if you can change the reader's emotion through all of those steps on that story circle, then you have a story that resonates with someone and gives you a satisfying conclusion.
Oh, that's phenomenal. I've never thought it, because something I struggle with is short form. I've never thought of it that way. Like, I always try and approach it from, I guess, a long form mindset, going through the hero's journey or whatever it is. So that's something that I personally struggle with. And that's just opened my mind to figuring out, okay, maybe I need to look at it more as just something a lot more simple. So thank you.
Yeah. It's tugging at the emotions is what really makes writing resonate. I just read Anthony Horowitz's James Bond book, Forever and a Day. And there's one scene in it. Yeah, Anthony Horowitz is so good. He's a craftsman. He's not an artist, he's a craftsman, but he's a master craftsman. And there's that one scene where James Bond faces what you think is going to be an absolutely horrific fate. And even though we know it's not, this is a prequel to Casino Royale. We know he's going to be fine. We know because there are 12 books that tell us he's going to be fine. But still, it was so well written. My skin crawled and I felt this sense of dread. Because Anthony Horowitz was so good at making you feel that emotion. That's the
acid scene. Yeah, I'm
yeah,
thinking,
yeah.
Oh my god, that was. I've gone. How's he going to get out of this? You're sitting there on the edge of your seat. Just the way that whole sequence is structured, you go, he's not going to make it out. It's how.
And High Point, for me, that's why I enjoyed writing it so much, because I got to a point where I did my writing for the day, and then I was doing my washing up and listening to the Iron Man 3 soundtrack, and I was like, how the hell am I going to get my heroes out of this? And I think when you're writing action stories, I think that's what you really need at that climax point. You need to get to the point where it's like, there is no way that they can get out of this, and then they get out of it. But you have to have that, because that's what really gets people invested when they're biting their nails.
That's, yeah. Wow. Okay, that's completely just opened my mind for my personal writing. So thank you. In terms of what are you currently working on? I know obviously High Point. You've released a couple of other shorts since then as well.
My most recent book, I had a kind of dry spell. My most recent book was called Nobody Rides for Free, and it was part of my biker series. And I love writing my biker series. And I've already planned out the next 4 books in this biker series.
Wow.
And they're all set in Las Vegas, and there are certain elements that I'm kind of like shamelessly lifting from Diamonds Are Forever and Casino Royale, even though if you read them, you wouldn't really tell. But if you're a Bond fan and you read my books, you're going to be like, oh, you did it again, Roland. Oh, no, it's like Easter eggs. And so I'm trying to write the next book in that series, which I really love doing. And just the other day, I got a post from my number one Swedish fan, Susanna, she's such a fan. I named the High Point Suzanne after her.
Wow. What an honor.
I know, but she's great. It's like when fans really make a difference to me when they send emails and say their books. And she was like, when's the next book? And she's always like pestering me when I post something of doing something like kids. She's like, you should be writing the next book. So I want to get that one written. But I have a passion project that I'm really, really excited about. And it was kind of inspired by being so part of the James Bond community, because I kept thinking back to, like, I wanted to write spy novels, but I know that as a middle-aged white guy writing in third-person perspective, it's going to be boring as hell in an oversaturated market. How could I make it different? And I thought, what if you wrote them as romance novels? And then I want to write a romance novel that's inspired and pays homage to Dr. No. And in fact, I plan to write a series, all of which they are not stealing any intellectual property or being copyright or anything like that, but they are so strongly influenced by the movies rather than the books, and telling them as a romance story. And it's exciting to me because it's like you get to a playground of action figures to play with. And I've asked a couple of the James Bond community whether they'd help me out, because one of the inspirations for James Bond was Alexander Stevenson, was that his name? Who is this super spy who is based in the Rockefeller Center in New York City, working for an undercover organization called, I think, which basically protected British interests in America. And I thought, what if that place was still running? And so I thought, what if it was like the secret wing of the British government in the Rockefeller Center, which is, just down the road from me. And I was like, Joe Darlington has the Being James Bond podcast, and he calls himself head of section. So I was like, Joe, can I borrow your name? Joe Darlington sounds quite British. You could be quite a good head of section. And I actually asked Calvin Dyson, I was like, will you be my Q? Because I thought Dyson, like the guy who made the vacuum cleaner. So Calvin has very, very kindly volunteered his name. There is this wonderful cosplayer called Spencer Marie in Canada. So she's going to be the kind of like Moneypenny figure, because the difference between my books and James Bond books is James Bond, the movies, it's all James Bond in all 25 of them. But as romance novels, that doesn't work, because a romance novel has to have a hero and a heroine. They have to end up together, smoochy, smoochy, love forever after. Like he can't then boot her out and then be available in the next book, because no woman would want anything to do with that. So I'm writing books about a spy agency in the Rockefeller Center in New York, and each book is going to be about a different secret agent who falls in love and has a happy ever after with the Bond girl kind of thing. And so immediately you've got to have a different agent in each book, which is kind of exciting, which makes it more interesting to read. So my first book is inspired by Dr. No, and you have a character called Mark Hazard, which is actually, I think, an undercover name that James Bond went under in The Man with the Golden Gun, I believe. So you've got secret agent Mark Hazard, and then you needed a Bond girl. Who is the Bond girl in Dr. No?
Honey Rider.
Kind of. There's Sylvia Trench as well, wasn't there?
True, there is. Yes, I always forget Sylvia. She's the very first Bond girl when you think about it.
Yeah, and one of the other conventions of a romance novel is the hero and the heroine have to meet have to meet or encounter or have some kind of like bang together at the end of the first chapter. And of course, you don't even meet Honey until like the beginning of Act 3. So what are you going to do? And I thought Sylvia is the one he meets in the casino in Act 1. And he's like, oh, very interesting. And she's like, oh, very interesting. And she comes back from Russia with Love. So in some ways, if you wanted to have a story based on Dr. No, in which there's a happily ever after, you'd have to have Sylvia be the Bond girl rather than Honey. But what can you do about that? So I smushed them together. And I have a character called Sylvia Mariana, whose real name is Sylvia Trench, who is the face of, she's a fashion model called the Girl with the Golden Nose, because her nose is broken. And of course, she's the face of a perfume called Honey Child, because I smushed together Sylvia and Honey Child into a same character. And it's about Mark Hazard and Honey Child, and they have this wild adventure in Jamaica. And I'm really excited to write it. And so many of the elements you can take from the books and things and it's been really fun. And I really want to finish that off. And I want to ask Sean Longmore, that brilliant artist, to do the cover, because he does these wonderful.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Sean's work, they're downstairs, but his art is incredible. I mean, I've seen even some of he's been doing recently a bunch of, I think, Torchwood and Doctor Who covers as well. Phenomenal. Like really, really talented guy.
Yeah, he gets it. It's like, I think if I write and publish these books, there are going to be Bond fans who just get it. And it's like with his art, there are Bond fans who just get it. And it's like, I think in the back, Calvin Dyson's always got his, The Culture of Bond, Mike Poplawski, he's got Sean Longmore art. And it's wonderful to see, because they are just brilliant. And I love it. I love the fact that we live in a time now where, there are so many different variations of the things you love, and then they're being recreated and reinvented in all sorts of exciting ways. I mean, my love of James Bond just got reinvigorated by the Bond community, because there's so much more going on.
Absolutely. I think, all of this for me started during lockdown and COVID and everything, because I needed something to do. And watching guys like Calvin and David and Joe, those three, pardon me, so they really inspired me to start creating, and it rekindled a passion. I mean, my fiance just goes, "You're a bloody nerd." Like you're watching these like 3-hour-long book clubs about James Bond. Obviously I've got all my other nerd stuff as well. I love my superheroes and all that sort of stuff, but my first love and my real love is James Bond. So I can totally see the connection there. I think, going back to the story, the idea of Sylvia as the main girl is so much more exciting as well, because Honey, but in the film, she's a bit of a boring character. Like, she's just there. Like, she's hot. She's really hot. She looks great in a bikini, but she's just there as eye candy. Whereas someone like Sylvia, who can go, toe to toe with Bond at an intellectual level, and she's, I can't remember if this is correct or not, but I think she's married and she's having an affair with Bond. So like, she's choosing to be a bit duplicitous as well. They're suited to each other to a T.
Yeah, and she and Madeline are the only Bond girls who come back for two. So she must have meant something to him.
Exactly, except for Moneypenny, of course.
Oh yeah.
Well, well, Roland, I really appreciate you coming on. I had an hour penciled out for this. So we'll wrap up our conversation now, because I know you've got family things to get onto, and an evening ahead. Before you go, though, I'd really like to hear from you. What are some authors and some podcasts, or some content that you'd recommend the listeners of this show checking out?
Well, if you're a writer, I want to give a shout out to, on Instagram, a fellow writer who is a fellow Australian. Her name is Amy McNee, and she's at Inspired to Write on Instagram. And if you want inspiration to get into writing and do this crazy journey, definitely follow her. The next people I would recommend, there's a great bloke on Instagram, Caleb Daniels, who's at Commando Bond. Really enjoy him. One of the guys in the Bond community I absolutely adore as a friend, adore, what a weird word to do. The Bond Armory, he helped so much with like facts and figures about guns and stuff, because I was like, what kind of gun would you need? And so I reached out to Ray from the Bond Armory on Instagram. He's got a YouTube channel as well. Yeah, and he was just so awesome in like giving me advice and support and encouragement about the right types of weapons to use. And he's got a great YouTube channel you should check out as well. There are so many people out there that the other fellas is a podcast I listen to. Of course, you got all of the people we've already mentioned, like Calvin Dyson and David Zaritsky and Being James Bond. So you have no shortage of people to reach out for. In terms of authors, though, I'm just going to mention one in particular. She's called CB Salmon, and she writes kind of what I write, which are adventure stories, except as romance stories. And she's got an epic fantasy series, and she's got like this series called the Rider Files, which are like I don't know, NCIS kind of things, but they're really great. And I definitely recommend those if you're interested in the idea of like adventure stories from a different perspective.
I love that. That sounds really, really interesting. I'll definitely have to check her out. And all of the people that we've mentioned as well, I'll put in the show notes. So anyone listening,
if you want me to help you that, let me know, because I always promise that in the things, like, I'll put all the things down in the description. And when I'm writing the description, I'm like, oh God, now I have to Google them and find them out.
I've been typing them as you've been saying them. So if I've got the spelling wrong, you can help me out there. We'll finish. I'd love just to hear one nugget of wisdom from you. What is one piece of advice that you'd give any aspiring writer who's starting their journey out as an author? What would that one piece of advice be?
Do you know, it's something my late brother, who passed away recently, he used to sign off all his emails to me, keep the faith. It was actually from Bon Jovi. He was a huge Bon Jovi fan. So he was, quite proud that I ended up in New Jersey. But keep the faith is what you need to do. It's like, if you are crazy enough to write stories, you have to write stories. They say writers are like rats. Rats have their teeth. If they don't gnaw on their teeth, they grow up and actually go through into their skull. Writers are like that. If we don't write, we go crazy. It's like I say we hear the sound of trumpets. You're basically receiving signals from some radio, and you have to download them onto the page and share them with people. And it's a burden that you have as a creative person, but it's one you should adopt and put out there, because there has never been a better time right now or more opportunity to be successful as a creative person. So just do it. And even if you don't find success at first, keep the faith and keep doing it. And eventually you will start to build more success and find your niche and be successful. The only people who are successful are the ones that didn't quit. So yeah, just be a stupid, stubborn idiot like me, and you will get a lot further than if you quit.
I love that. That's such a wise bit of advice. So thank you very much again, Roland, for coming on. Where can everyone find you? Where are you located in the wide world of the internet?
I'm pretty much at Roland Hulme everywhere. And if you write that in and go to Amazon, you can see there. And of course, my author name is Simone Scarlett, MMA. I put the MMA at the end because I wrote MMA-based stories when I first started out, so that didn't sell very many copies. But yeah, Roland Hulme, I'm out there everywhere. So yeah, I would be excited to chat to anybody who hears this.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much again, Roland, for coming on. It's been an absolute privilege to have you on. And I really, really just want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart for coming on and taking the time to talk to me today. And I hope to have you on again in the near future.
Oh, thanks so much, Josh. This was a ton of fun.
So that was my interview with Roland Hulme. You can find all links to Roland's social media as well as his Amazon page in the show notes below. Once again, I just want to say a massive thank you to Roland for coming on and taking the time to talk with me today. It was an incredible interview, and I hope you enjoyed listening to our chat. I've been your host, Josh Gay, and this is Selling Secrets Podcast. You can find us on social media on Instagram at Selling Secrets Pod. We're also on Facebook now, so if you just search in Selling Secrets Podcast, you'll be able to find us on Facebook as well. And you can follow me on Instagram at 007Oz, which is at 007AUS. Until next time, thank you very much for listening. Here's a sneak peek of my interview coming next week with Luke Taggart, aka Bond's Apartment.
The YouTube thing, I think I was just kind of, the bond fatigue thing is real. It's a real thing. I'm sure you've dealt with it. It's difficult sometimes to come up with content. And, there was like a string of for example, with Jake being one of our hosts, Jake started a new job. He had a baby. Then it was like Lorenzo and I was like, when it's just the two of us or just like a combination, like some episodes are really good and we really hit our stride. And some of them it's like, maybe it'd be better if it was all three of us or whatever it may be. And then it was like, with No Time to Die, I really started collecting a lot more than I ever had, especially sartorial stuff. And I was like, I've always gravitated towards what David had been doing and Joe. And then I started seeing people like Kelvin Dyson's YouTube channel is unbelievable. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I need to start doing this because, we're still working from home. We're still not necessarily locked down, but just it's like I had a lot of creative energy that it didn't seem to be right for the podcast thing or Instagram. It was just something else, not that it wasn't like, oh, I want to keep this for myself, nothing like that. But it just wasn't that. It wasn't like, oh, I've got this great idea for a podcast. It was like, no, I want to know, 5 ways to wear the NPL sweater like I did.
Yeah.
You can't talk about that. You got to show people. What better way to do that than something like YouTube? So, and then of course I've had very good mentors and people helping me with the YouTube. So.